In some cases, you will need to make requests to third-party sources. For example, you may need to grab a Twitter feed or grab an image. There are various methods out there for retrieving content from external sources with PHP. WordPress isn't very biased. Instead, it provides an HTTP API that tries all methods out there so that you aren't limited to just one. The HTTP API can make any request you want, whether it's a post or GET request. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to learn more about this API. Here's what WordPress has to say about it. Within PHP, there are many possible ways to send an HTTP request. For simplicity, these methods will be referred to collectively as transports for this article. The purpose for the HTTP API is to support as many of them as possible with an API that is simple and standard for each of the transports. The problem is that web hosting servers support different transports and some might support none. The solution then is to support as many as possible to allow for those who have hosts that disable one or two to still access the web through one of the other transports that might still be enabled or supported. By using this API, we save ourselves the headaches of determining what method to use to make HTTP requests. Let's try using this API now. Right now, I'm looking at one of the recipes. Do you remember how we created this piece of info? If you can recall, we created a template separate from our code and used the file get contents function to get this info. However, a lot of hosts out there disable this function and its extension. Relying on this one method to retrieve content will eventually cause us to run into errors. We should let WordPress handle the best method for retrieving content. We're going to update the filter-content.php file so that it can use the WordPress HTTP API to retrieve and process the template. If you scroll down this page, you'll find a list of helper functions for using the HTTP API. The WP remote get function is what we want to use. Let's use this function now. Inside the filter function, define a variable named recipe_tpl_res. Its value will be set to the value returned by the WP remote get function. This function has two parameters. First is the URL. I'm going to use the plugins URL function to retrieve the URL to the plugins folder. Keep in mind that this must be an HTTP URL and not a system path. Also note that the URL doesn't have to be from our own site. You can make requests to URLs outside of the site the plugin is installed on. The second parameter we can set is additional headers or info about this request. This is optional, and we don't need this kind of power at the moment, so we'll let WordPress decide the default settings. This function will end up returning an array that will contain various pieces of information about the response received. Fortunately, WordPress also provides a set of utility functions to help process and grab the information we care about. Replace the contents function with a function called WP remote retrieve body. This function will parse a response object and return the contents of the response. So replace these values with the response like so. Let's refresh the page. We should receive no errors. Our content should still be displaying along with the recipe template and its data. That's it for the HTTP API. To recap what's going on, the WP remote get function will make a request to a URL and return the results of that request. The WP remote retrieve body will parse that response and return only the contents of that response. In our case, it would be the template. Feel free to read up on the documentation to learn more about it. As an exercise, try doing the same thing to our recipe creator shortcode. If you can remember, this shortcode also uses the file get contents function. Replace that using the WordPress HTTP API.